Hi guys, it's Mr. Y. Today we're going to be talking a little bit of history about Darwin and how he discovered a new, and I put new in quotes, view on biology. Now, keep in mind when we say Darwin discovered a new view on biology, it's kind of like saying Christopher Columbus discovered America. The place was already there, it's just he's the one we give credit to for discovering it for all major intents and purposes. Darwin's new view on biology had actually been discussed by others before him. He was just the one who gets most of the credit because he was the one who actually was able to put into words all these concurring ideas into something that made sense, into one concise notion. So keep in mind there are people before Darwin and people after Darwin who had these very similar views to him, but he was the one who gets most of the credit for this, and we'll explain why that is later on. Now, before we go into the history of Darwin, I want to just recap on the definition of the word species. Species are groups of organisms that can actually do three things. One, they can mate. So let's make a quick little list here. One, they have to be able to mate, and that's assuming, of course, we're dealing with a sexually reproducing creature and that we have a female and male of the species, or the two potential species. Two, they have to be able to reproduce, to produce an offspring. They have to be able to have an offspring. Now, this is where people screw up because they think those two alone meet the definition, and that's not what the definition says. Because there's one other key thing. It says they must be able to produce a fertile offspring. That means the offspring must be able to have kids of its own. Have offspring. Because if the offspring is sterile, that is unable to have kids, then there's no way the line gets passed on. Can't be sterile. And keep in mind, this is a working definition. It's not perfect for the definition of species. There is no perfect definition of species, or I'd be giving it to you. But for your guys' level of biology, this will work. And I'll show you where the fault in this definition lies later on, but for now, keep in mind, species must be able to mate, assuming, again, they have different genders and they're sexually reproducing, have offspring, and the offspring that they produce must be able to further have offspring for them to be considered the same species. That will work at this level of biology. So, for example, if we have two creatures, a horse and a donkey, and my question to you is, are they the same species? Well, some people will look at them and say, well, they look the same, or they behave the same, or they eat the same stuff, or they live in the same place, and they would say, yeah, they're the same species. Well, that does not matter to the definition. The definition says, can they mate, first off? And the answer is yes, they actually can. Can they produce an offspring? Yeah, they can. But they are not the same species because when they do produce an offspring, the resulting offspring are both sterile. And again, you get either a mule or a hinny depending on who's the father and who's the mother. But in either case, neither of these offspring, these guys, will ever be able to have offspring with any cross version of either the other one or with a parent species of horse or the donkey. They are essentially sterile. And again, it doesn't matter which way you do the crossing. Now, let's ask this question again. Are tigers and lions the same? Some people would say yes. They're both cats. They both eat meat. They both can live in the same areas. If you know anything about tigers and lions, they both exist in India. But based upon the definition, the strict definition of the term species, they are not the same species. Because again, even though they can mate, and we know this because people who have them in captivity have done this, and even though they can produce offspring, again, this has happened thanks to people having tigers and lions in captivity with each other, the offspring themselves are both essentially sterile. It doesn't matter whether they're mated across each other or with a parent species. It doesn't matter. They both essentially cannot produce their own lineage, therefore they are not the same species. That is what the definition of species is saying. It must be able to mate, produce offspring, and those offspring must be fertile. So that even if I don't show you a picture of two organisms, so we have insect A, insect B, insect D, insect E, and I say, okay, A and B are going to be a mating pair, and D and E are going to be a mating pair. If A and B produces an insect, let's say C, that's sterile, and D and E produces an insect F, that's fertile, which, if any, are the same species? Well, based solely on the definition and knowing nothing else about these creatures, you would have to conclude that D and E are the same species, whereas A and B are different species. That's how powerful the definition can be. Again, you don't have to know its behavior. You don't have to know where it lives or what it looks like. You have to know, can it mate with the other organism? Can it produce an offspring? And is that offspring a fertile offspring? So, brief recap of the definition of species. Now, for the sake of honesty, just so I can say I did actually mention this, it is possible for a female liger, that's a lion father and tiger mother, to actually have offspring with a tigon. We know because it's happened once. But keep in mind a few things actually. One, it's only happened one time. It was conceived in captivity under human supervision, meaning neither of these two creatures, the liger or the tigons, exist naturally in the wild. They're only for the entertainment of tourists. So, the one time the liger and tigon actually had a species, and these are the actual pictures of these guys, it's only happened the one time under extreme human supervision. Every other time these things have been sterile. And that's kind of where the definition falls a little flat. Again, it's a working definition. It doesn't work all the time 100%, but it works for the level you guys are dealing with. I'll show you other examples in class of where sometimes the definition kind of gets muddled and it's hard to tell where one species stops and another species begins. But again, just remember, keep the 3 steps in mind. They have to be able to mate, produce offspring, and those offspring must be fertile, and that will work every time. All right. So for this next step, I need you guys to do a thought experiment. And my recommendation before you begin this thought experiment is to think of a creature in the wild. Don't think of anything like a horse or a cow or a dog or a cat. Think of something that exists in nature outside of human interference. So I'll give you 2 suggestions. Let's deal with sea turtles, or you can think about fir trees, or another good example would probably be something like penguins, like emperor penguins. So think of something that exists in the wild, and I'm going to give you guys a set of postulates to consider. So postulates are statements that are inherently taken to be true, but I want you guys to actually consider these and ask yourself, when thinking about a species, whether you're thinking about sea turtles, or whether you're thinking about a penguin, or whether you're thinking about fir trees, or any other organism you can think of, ask yourself, is this true or is this false? So let's go through these one at a time. First postulate. Individuals in a species, so we're talking about individuals in the same species, so like 2 sea turtles or 2 penguins or 2 fir trees. Individuals in a species show variety in their traits. That is to say, they show variety in how fast they are, their speed, or their intelligence, or their eyesight, or their height, if you're talking about fir trees, or their ability to produce seeds. So, do individuals in a species show variety in their traits? Again, within the same species, do we see variety in traits? Is that a true or false statement? Well, if you're thinking about this properly, you should see the answer is obvious. Of course it's a true statement. You can see that with even humans. There is differences in speed, intelligence, eyesight among any animal within that same species. The second postulate, again, keep something wild in mind, like the sea turtles or the penguins. Some of these variations, that is to say, some of the variations from the first one, like speed, intelligence, eyesight, are passed on from parents to offspring, so that offspring tend to resemble their parents. Well, think about this. Do you ever see a sea turtle give birth to a penguin? Probably not. Okay, well, that makes sense. So the offspring do tend to resemble, but do the variations tend to get passed on? Does that make sense? Do people who are, for instance, naturally taller tend to have taller children? Yeah, that would make sense. Do you think that happens in the wild? Do slightly taller trees that manage to produce slightly taller offspring trees? Yeah, that makes sense as well. So variations do tend to get passed on from one generation to the next, meaning that offspring tend to resemble. Notice I didn't say they're not identical, because most of the time we're talking about sexual reproduction. So we say they tend to resemble their parents in certain attributes. Not all attributes, of course. A third postulate. In every generation, more offspring are born than will survive. And let me clear up that word survive. We mean survive to the age of sexual reproduction, the age of sexual maturity. So let's think about the sea turtles. In every generation, more offspring are born than will survive. Does that seem true for the sea turtles? Are there more offspring that will survive than are born? No, not really. If you know anything about sea turtles, you know most of them will die before their first year. The same is true for penguins, and of course, most of the seeds that a tree produces don't actually germinate and grow into other trees. So in every generation, more offspring are born than will survive to adulthood. This means that limited resources leads to competition for access to those resources. So you will have, for instance, colonies of penguins competing over space or over access to fish or access to shelter or access to mates. So competition exists because there are more offspring that were born than will ultimately be able to survive. True. And finally, the last one. The ability to survive and reproduce is not random. Individuals who survive and reproduce are those whose traits, their abilities, inherent, either physical or intellectual or however you want to think of it, will be passed on, unlike those who are unable to survive and reproduce. So, individuals who can both survive and reproduce are those whose genes are passed on. Does that seem like a true or false statement? Well, you should note that's true because, of course, if you die, you can't pass on your genes. If you don't survive to the age of sexual reproduction, if you're a baby sea turtle, you're not going to be able to have offspring. So all four of these postulates should make sense as being true. Now, what I'm going to show you next, I want to make sure you do actually get a copy of. So take a moment and pause the lecture and make sure you get a copy of the next slide. It is a long slide, but you're going to see how in one quote all four of these postulates get used towards a conclusion. Again, the postulates were that there's variation within a species, that some of this variation is passed on from parents to offspring, that more offspring are born than will survive, and that the ability to survive and reproduce is not a random feature. Those whose traits allow them to survive and reproduce will be those whose genes get passed on. So this quote that you're going to see is not from me. My words are going to be in parentheses, but I do want you to get this whole quote down for your notes. As many more individuals of each species are born than can possibly survive, that's one of the postulates, and as there is frequently a reoccurring struggle for existence, notice that's competition, it follows that any being, any form of life, if it vary, however slightly, in any manner profitable to itself under the complex and sometimes varying conditions of life, that's the very first postulate, will have a better chance of surviving and thus be naturally selected. From the strong principle of inheritance, any selected variety will tend to propagate. Propagate simply means to pass down and spread its new and modified form. That's both postulates 2 and postulate 4, about there being variation that's passed on and that it's not random which variation gets passed on. That is a direct quote from Charles Darwin in his book, The Origin of Species. Okay, so let's talk about Darwin as a person. Darwin actually had attempted 2 other careers before working in biology. He was actually from a family of doctors, and he kind of dropped out of medical school for being such a bad student. It didn't interest him. And then he actually went to school to become a priest, and also didn't have any interest in that. So his big background in science actually comes as a hobbyist in geology. He was very aware of the major patterns in the fossil record. So all those patterns from the timeline of the history of the Earth, he would have known all about. He had studied it extensively and read up on all of that stuff. And then at 22 years old, again, this was by the time he hit his 3rd career, he was 22, he decided to sign up aboard the HMS Beagle. Now, HMS means it's a British ship. And in 1831, he was signed on as the ship's naturalist. This is somebody who studies the natural world. And the ship was chartered to sail around the world over a period of 5 years, and Darwin was to study what he observed in nature during that time. Here's a picture of a replica of the ship. They actually have a museum of it in England because they actually built this whole replica of the HMS Beagle. Now, most of the 5 years that Darwin spent was actually on land, not on the ship itself. And he became interested in understanding why species of certain types live in certain places and not in others. Why you could only find certain species in South America but not in Australia, and why you could only find certain species like, say, kangaroos only in Australia but not in South America. And he made thousands of observations and wrote a lot of stuff down in books. He had written like 5 observational books by the time he had come back about many known and several unknown species. Here is just a very brief synopsis of the major points of Darwin's travel. Again, he sailed entirely around the world. You can see that he starts off in England and then spends quite a bit of time in South America here. But he doesn't really spend too much time many other places except for Australia and a few places here in Africa. He never makes it to Asia. But by far the biggest place of port that he was known for was over here in this section. And we'll get to that in a bit. Here's a more detailed map of all the different stops, and you can see they've highlighted up here in the corner all the ports he stopped at in South America. And again, he was not only making observations, he was also collecting fossils, and he collected specimens. So he would capture birds, fishes, whatever he can grab, plants, and then just start preserving them or bring them back with him to England. So he just starts collecting, and he starts wondering, why are there only certain species in some places and not in others? And why do you see this species here and not over here? So this began to nag at him. And as I said, the most famous spot that he stopped at was in this little section of islands up here, this little archipelago called the Galapagos. And he'd already been through South America by this point, so he'd already mapped and learned about lots of different things in South America. He had seen fossils in South America of giant sloths and things that were obviously extinct, but it was in the Galapagos that he got his big puzzles starting to hit him, and he couldn't understand what was going on. So for instance, on the Galapagos Islands, there's a bird called the cormorant. Now, cormorant is a general name for a seabird, and they had them in South America. That's these guys over here, and you can see they're large winged birds. They can land on the water like ducks, but they have this really pointed nose here for catching and spearing fish. Well, when Darwin gets to the Galapagos, he sees these things. Now, they look like cormorants, but obviously there's a difference. Their wings look very, very raggedy, for lack of a better word. These things were flightless. They could not fly. But what they could do is they could swim, and they could swim very well. So they didn't necessarily starve, but they couldn't fly. And Darwin wondered, okay, so why is the cormorant here such a weird variety? And again, it wasn't just one cormorant he saw like this. It was all the cormorants there on the Galapagos were flightless. Aside from that, he saw some other things on the Galapagos that you couldn't ever find, certain species of beetles and species of giant tortoises. In addition, things like this guy here, a swimming iguana. For the most part, iguanas on the mainland in South America don't swim at all. They avoid the water. But in the Galapagos Islands, they swim very actively and very agilely. And these are actually Darwin's own notes, his own handwriting. And you can see, we'll talk about this later, how he's trying to connect certain things using a tree diagram. And all his preserved specimens of insects, again, thousands of insects, birds, hundreds of birds, and lots of observations. So Darwin gets back from his travels, and he gets back to England, and he's confused by all these specimens, because after he's reviewing them, he's discovering more and more that these are really different species from what he was observing from one place to another, especially between the Galapagos and the mainland of South America. And very early on, around 1838, he develops this idea of what he calls descent with modification, passing down changes. But he's not convinced, and he was rightfully not so, because he didn't have the evidence to support it. So he spends the next 25 years of his time using the evidence he collected and the evidence from others to support his ideas from his ship's notes. And he writes a book on it, but he doesn't actually publish his book, his idea, until 1859. And the reason why he doesn't publish until much later is because he originally had intended never to publish. Another scientist who was working in Southeast Asia by the name of Wallace came very close to publishing before Darwin. And what Wallace had done is Darwin had worked with many different species in different areas, and he sent Darwin a paper, and he said, Darwin, please look at this paper, tell me what you think of it. And Darwin looked at Wallace's paper, and he said, oh, this is my idea. I better publish, or Wallace is going to tell everybody about this first. So Darwin actually publishes kind of in a rush. He writes his book really rather quickly, he says, and it sells out. It makes him lots of money, and keep in mind, at the time in England, most of the population in 1859 cannot read. So his book selling out is a big deal. So things to remember about Darwin's idea, which is properly titled The Theory of Evolution by Natural Selection. So evolution was actually a concept that was around before Darwin. That was one of those things Darwin kind of pulled from, but Darwin's great addition to it was this part. Natural selection. The idea that evolution works majority-wise by this process of natural selection. And there's more misconceptions about evolution by natural selection than any other topic in biology. People think, oh, Darwin came up with the idea of evolution. No, he didn't come up with the idea. It was around before him. And secondly, evolution can work by other means besides natural selection. It's just that natural selection explains evolution in nature. Darwin made his argument about evolution by natural selection knowing nothing about genetics at all. He knew nothing about chromosomes, about mitosis, meiosis. Well, he knew about mitosis, but he didn't know exactly what that process was doing. He didn't know about DNA or how it allowed people to inherit traits. He only knew that offspring tended to have traits that were similar to the parents. That was one of the first postulates. And Darwin did not invent the theory of evolution. Again, evolution was a concept that had actually been around well before Darwin, a couple hundred years before Darwin. It's just that people couldn't explain how it was working. Darwin simply suggested the method by which evolution was occurring, what he called natural selection. And it turns out this method also helped to explain all the major trends in the fossil record we see, of things being relatively simple and becoming more and more gradually complex and more complex and more complex and more specific to the environment that they lived in. And keep in mind, one of the biggest and most important ideas of all biology is the notion that natural selection, this process that drives evolution, places a prime importance on life's ability to survive and reproduce, meaning life is geared towards those two processes. And yes, there can be a trade-off. You can have processes that are more geared towards survival than reproduction. And if you evolve more towards one, you can run the risk of costing in another. So think of peacocks, for instance. Peacocks place a very high importance, if you're a male peacock, on a trait to help you reproduce, the bright, beautiful feathers. But they actually hurt your ability to survive. You can't get away from predators, you obviously can't hide as well, and you're going to have trouble flying away or trying to escape a predator with those long feathers slowing you down. But those two together is what natural selection really focuses on. So we'll talk more about how to interpret Darwin's idea of evolution by natural selection in the next video lecture. So make sure you ask questions in class if you have any, and I'll see you next time.